Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to our monthly edition of Les 8 du Mois Until We're There. I am Teresa Moreira, head of the Competition and Consumer Policies branch of UNCTAD, and I will be the moderator for today. I would like to start by thanking our distinguished guests. Dr. Sebastián Barocelli, Director, National Directorate on Consumer Protection and Consumer Arbitration of Argentina. Dr. Betilde Muñoz Pogossian, Director from the Department of Social Inclusion of the Organization of American States. Ms. Helena Leurent, Director General of Consumers International. Ms. Arlin Chondro, founder of Pick Me Naturals, an e-commerce company offering health-related products across Indonesia and member of UNCTAD eTrade for Women, for their participation at the Les 8 du Mois Until We're There initiative and contribution to building generation equality. I will now give the floor to Deputy Secretary General of UNCTAD, Madame Isabelle Durant. DSG, you have the floor.
Thank you, Teresa, and good morning, good afternoon to all of you. And we will discuss today an important issue. We know, all of us, that achieving gender equality is a key goal for a lot of the UN organization, but also for a lot of countries and a lot of communities. Much progress has been achieved, but many hurdles remain. And probably in this room, we are all aware, but others are more hidden and can unconsciously or even consciously contribute to stereotyping and lead to unequal opportunities, or particularly for women. So in this today event, we want to talk about how consumer protection can contribute to gender equality. There are all sorts of gender-related problems in consumer information, labeling, health and safety, advertising, accessibility, treatment, contracts, or applications forms. So there is a lot of way to look at this problem. And I will start with advertising. Advertising is an obvious one, an obvious case to illustrate the concern. And let me show you, Teresa, you will do it. Let me show you an image that, the kind of image that maybe we have seen on the bus stop or I don't know where. So why do we need this kind of image to justify this product? That's one example. So of course, it is not to argue that gender cannot play any role in advertisement. It's not true, because certain markets are naturally geared towards men or women, of course, and gender is a powerful dimension. But some ads reinforce stereotypes and contribute to misinformation or discrimination, and that is where consumer protection must come in and do something. So I would use another example, which is more a digital example. And I think especially on algorithm, on social media platforms, because they use information from our profiles and lead us to specific goods and services in line with assumptions of our preferences. So it guides us to a certain direction. And clearly there is a risk that the consumer may not be completely or well informed with the diversity of what he can normally find. So this problem has been recognized, and the United Nations in their guidelines for consumer protection recognize the vulnerability of consumers in both cases and other cases. The imbalance in terms of economic capacity, level of education, and bargaining power. Calling also attention to the importance of consumer protection policies as a tool to promote social and economic development and sustainability. These guidelines, which are our Bible in consumer protection in UNCTAD, the guidelines consider that consumer education contributes to women's knowledge and bargaining power, fundamental for their personal and professional development. For example, financial matters and financial education, business best practices, and essential goods and services. However, the sensitivity and progress on this issue is not identical across countries or world regions. And at the forefront is Argentina. Argentina produced a guide to good business practices on gender and diversity. And it is the first document to address sensitive issues in consumer relations. It refers to human rights instruments, such as the Convention for Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and addresses sexist practices that create rigidly and limiting stereotypes which subordinate women and people of non-binary identities. So this guide proposed recommendations to identify and dismantle discriminatory practices through examples that generate healthy, sustainable, egalitarian, and respectful consumption relationships. And so I look forward to hearing more about this guide during our conversation, because Mr. Barocelli is with us and he will explain what was done. So just to end this introduction, just that you could know that this initiative, Les 8 du mois, until we are there, of course, until we are there, I mean, when equality will be totally addressed, or I'm not sure that it will be tomorrow. So I think that we have a lot of 8 du mois. Each 8 of the months, we try to discuss or to highlight one aspect of the gender inequality. And I think that it's important to continue not only the 8th of March, but each month and regularly to come back to all those aspects. And today we will explore a little bit further consumer protection. So thank you, and I look forward to listen to you.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Secretary General. Women can play different roles in society and in the market, acting as workers, entrepreneurs, services providers, and consumers, as all individuals are consumers when they acquire products for themselves or their households. So women are consumers all the time. Since women tend to have a decisive voice when choosing goods and services for their households, they can influence more sustainable, more responsible, and better informed choices when benefiting from education and information campaigns and awareness-raising initiatives. We will continue this discussion at the roundtable. The session will address 4 questions that will be discussed in 2 rounds. We invite the audience to address their questions in the question and answer feature in the chat of the Zoom platform. So since our panelists have been introduced, we will start now with a video by Dr. Sebastián Barocelli, a Director of Consumer Protection Argentina, who unfortunately could not be with us, but wanted to share their experience on the elaboration of this very interesting guide.
Good afternoon to my colleagues. I would like to especially thank Dr. Teresa Moreira for this kind invitation to share the National Director on Consumer Protection of Argentina's experience on developing policies regarding gender and consumption. Sexist practices, those that naturalize gender inequalities, create limiting stereotypes and subordinate women and LGBT plus appear in different stages of the consumption relationship. That is why gender mainstreaming is essential to address them. Taking this into account, the National Director decided to implement gradual and soft law measures which aim to collective solution and not to punishing methods. We decided to develop a best commercial practices guideline on gender and diversities with the support of numerous institutions and associations in our country. As a result of that conducted work, the document was approved by resolution of the Directorate of Internal Trade of Argentina. The guideline aims to inspire healthy, sustainable, equality, and respectful of human dignity consumption relationships. The document is based on various international instruments, such as the Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, another soft law document related of this matter. The main purpose of the guideline is to reach all stakeholders in the market in order to gradually raise consumer education and business guidance. Once the document was approved, a compliance procedure was established to generate progressive and positive changes. Suppliers are invited to adhere to the document, to present and implement plan and period compliance reports. Concerning the content of the guideline, it goes through consumers' basic rights, establishing recommendations with a gender perspective. These recommendations arise for those specific situations in which sexist stereotypes are shown.
Well, we heard already a little bit about the Argentinian guides, which illustrates, as Sebastián said, commercial practices, consumer protection, and gender issues. Women are at the forefront as consumers, therefore contributing to improving and fostering consumer protection. So I would like to ask to our speakers, do women have a special role to play in consumer protection? Also, consumer protection can benefit from a gender-sensitive approach, considering that businesses, as we have heard, often undertake market practices that are not neutral and that may even be discriminatory, namely in advertising, product labeling, health and safety requirements. So my second connected question concerns the stereotyping. Why is stereotyping in advertisements a concern from the perspective of consumer protection, and what role can policy play? I would invite, if I may, Betilde to start, followed by Helena, and then Arlin to provide preliminary comments. Please try to stay within 3 minutes. Betilde, you have the floor.
Excellent. Good morning to everyone, and Maria Teresa, thanks so much for this invitation and for these great questions. I think, you know, we all here have some consensus in terms of the role the women play. So to answer your questions, yes, women do have a role to play in consumer protection. And on the second question, stereotyping, as in everything, can be detrimental to perpetuating situations of inequality and discrimination, and thus should be a concern for all agencies and all actors really working on consumer protection. And on the third question, yes, policy plays a fundamental role. And of course, I am representing an intergovernmental organization where we believe in the power of policies to transform people's realities. And in this regard, also definitely plays a role in this realm. To digest my responses a little bit more, on the first point, women, you know, we constitute half of the global population, so it stands to reason that we must have a role to play. But equality also plays a role as a central feature of our democratic society. Is one of the founding principles of the Organization of American States, really understood as the principles that all persons have the same rights, regardless of race, gender, sex, religion, social position, and all these inherent characteristics of individuals, their cultures, and their beliefs. And this principle, or this that is also an aspiration, has allowed women progressively to claim rights similar to those of men. At a global level, women have made progress indeed, and I always say that we should look at it as a glass half full, right? We've achieved important progress in terms of equality to men, but there is indeed a long way to go, no? In order to achieve this aspired equality. In this particular topic, we know that their buying power continues to increase, but they continue to earn less than men. In 2021, women earned 82 cents for every dollar earned by men for the same job performed and same or equivalent credentials. Worldwide, the average difference in annual spending power between men and women will nearly double from $236 today to $467 by the end of 2030, which is an increase of 97%. However, although women's consumer spending remains less than that of men, it is still substantial. No? In 2020, it was expected that women would control 43 trillion of global consumer spending through voluntary private consumption or an exchange of money for goods and services, which is also applicable to some countries of the region and also of the world. of the world. However, despite the disparity in spending power, women are the ones who do the shopping. In 2021, it was estimated that 89% of women across the world reported controlling or sharing daily shopping needs compared to only 41% of men, which again also speaks to the unequal distribution in the use of time between men and women, but also shows that women have a huge say in what consumer products are purchased. It is expected also that the female economy is poised to outpace the economy of some of the biggest nations in the next 5 years, according to latest research as of 2020. Another important role women play in consumer rights has to do with the role as caretakers. Again, we should be careful here in terms of perpetuating men's and women's roles. But in this point, since many recalls are related to children's products, women represent a first line of defense in reporting safety concerns related to children's toys, apparel, food, medicine, and other goods such as strollers or cribs, which are often subject to recalls. But we also need to be careful here because, again, keeping women in the caretaker role also has implications for them specifically and for society as a whole, in the sense that stereotyping in advertisements can serve, as I said, and it's already been mentioned, to perpetuate the inequality we seek to eliminate. So on the point of stereotyping, a word of caution in the sense that it can reinforce narratives about men and women in terms of the roles they play in society and how they should behave. And the example used by the deputy SG at the beginning really shows the importance of being careful about this, because perpetuates this idea of women should look a certain way, should have a role in the kitchen, should be the ones taking care of children, and men, displaying them as the breadwinners, working in a masculine job, which also kind of imposes limitations on men themselves. So by giving into stereotypes, we are limiting the full spectrum of human possibility and experience, not just for women, but also for men. And I believe my time is ending, so I would just want to mention the importance of gender mainstreaming in the design of public policies, right? Because this is an excellent tool to really transform the view of women, but also can help illustrate and better the situation of other groups that were mentioned, to LGBTI groups, for instance, in the sense that the invitation should be to keep a gender perspective, not just in binary terms, but also to think of the reality and how LGBTI people can also be consumers and can be affected by this stereotyping in this realm. So I will leave it at that, dear Maria Teresa, and we'll continue the discussion later.
Thank you very much, Betilde, for this very very strong start. I will refrain from comments, although it's very tempting, and will hand over to Helena for her remarks. Helena, you have the floor.
Sure, thank you. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. To Madame Durant, I was thinking about the title of this, and Until We're There. If you look at the World Economic Forum's gender gap report, it's going to be 135 years until we're there. And if you look at the economic gap, I think it's something like 267 years until we're there. So that's a lot of Zoom calls. We might need to speed things up a bit. In response to the importance of women specifically in consumer protection, I want to take a slightly different approach and just salute the leadership by women in the consumer movement. Just this week alone, we've been working at Consumers International on the Anne Fransen Fund. Anne Fransen was one of the leaders in the Dutch Consumentenbond movement, and she set up a fund which lives to this day to support consumer advocates around the world in low and middle income countries. And that has been of particular importance through the pandemic, as you can imagine. Going even further back in history, I had to write about sustainable fashion recently, and looking at the story of Frances Perkins, who was the leader of the New York Consumers League. She was a passionate advocate for better labor conditions, and really was the triangle shirtwaist tragedy, which was one of the most horrific tragedies of its day, was seared on her mind and really drove her actions to improve labor conditions. Her role as then the first, I think she was the first cabinet secretary in the US for the Roosevelt administration. She was one of the architects of the New Deal. So there, you know, historically, there are examples of women who have been leaders, and I'm inspired by women in leadership in consumer protection today. You know, Rosemary Siachitema was leader of Consumers Council of Zimbabwe, tragically passed away due to COVID. But currently, you know, one points to Siri in Thailand, to Marilena in Latin America, to Marta in the United States. You know, we're fortunate to have a really strong and to some degree balanced perspective in this movement. And I think that's one of the strengths of the movement. If we think about then how can consumer policy and consumer protection assist, I think we'd point to a couple of things. The first one is, of course, safety and safe products. Consumer Reports pointed out in 2019 that women are 47% more likely to be seriously injured in a car accident because of the way in which products are designed. If you look at financial inclusion, 1 in 3 women are excluded from the financial system. This is greater for the poorest consumers. I think this is a clear area for financial consumer protection. Getting ahead of issues about discrimination in artificial intelligence. The topic of today, fair representation in advertising, for many of the reasons that have been pointed out, and because people just don't feel represented in the way they feel, you know, they exist in society. Also, fighting for sustainable consumption. The climate crisis will hit the poorest hard. It will hit the marginalized most, and consumer protection and consumer policy focused on ensuring that we reach sustainable consumption and production fastest is crucial. I think there are some really interesting conversations going on about consumer and competition policy and gender at the moment. There are some really interesting things going on in terms of standards that address these points. And really, let's continue and build on that leadership and make sure that there is strong representation, not just in the decision-making bodies, but in the data that then goes towards setting what is expected and what is the norm for the future. So those would be some initial thoughts. And just thank you. Let's reduce that 137 to something within our lifetimes.
Thank you very much, Helena. So after the importance of the policies role, the amazing influence of civil society for the consumers movement across the world, and namely in a number of developing countries, because several of the names you mentioned are very familiar to all of us that have been working in the area. And now we are moved to Arlin, talking about the other important element, which is the private sector. Arlin, you have the floor.
Thank you, Teresa, and thank you for the floor, and thank you for having me here. I think I will bring the attention to something more daily and something that I do in my business, which is e-commerce in manufacturing and distributing health-related products. So I think there is also a divide in the way women view themselves, as when they see an advertisement and it portrays a woman in an offensive way, then they do get offended. But on the other hand, as a business person, or when they are the person making the advertising, designing the advertising, they might themselves fall into the trap of using women as an object, objectifying women. They might not realize that because sometimes they fall into a trap of placing more importance into the commercial aspect of things, and then they forget that they are also women. this is something that I see daily, and it's also a contradiction because in Indonesia, as maybe some of you know, socially the social construct is very conservative in their view of women, because we are the majority of Indonesian people are Muslims. We are a very Islamic country, and they view women in a very modest way. But how we portray ourselves and how the advertisements portray women can be very not conservative at all. And this gap in what is socially acceptable and what is commercially acceptable is something that should be bridged not only by the policymakers, not only by the government, but also by the female entrepreneurs. And not just the female entrepreneurs, because as the book Half the Sky mentions, we do hold up half the sky as women, but the other half of the sky is held up by men. And so men has to be involved in this kind of discussion. And so they are also aware about the conditions of gender equality. And so they can be more aware and implement practices or policies that are not derogatory or objectifying women. And I do agree with what Helena said, that consumer protection and consumer education is very important, because women are more prone to taking information as it is. And in terms of receiving information that are portrayed in a very, I would say, persuasive way in advertisement, then they might be blinded into not looking further into what is in their products, what are the ingredients. In terms of responsible production and consumption, then women has also the need to be educated, and this responsibility falls to the producers themselves, that they are the ones responsible in providing the education and the information for their consumers. I think that's all the thoughts that I have for the first initial two questions. And thank you, Teresa.
Thank you very much, Arlin. So indeed, the role and the importance of information and education, both for consumers and businesses. So of course, targeting the whole society. I would now like to move to the second part of Sebastián Barocelli speaking points, and then I will come back for another round of questions.
The recommendations are the result of international consensus and national experiences. Intersectionality is an important tool that contributes to the implementation of these guidelines, and is increase the understanding of each experiences on discrimination and oppression and the way they overlap and operate together. Argentina's national framework stimulates that the information provided to consumers must be faithful, clear, detailed, and accessible. The guide adds that it must not be targeted according to gender identities or biological characteristics. Some recommendations are to use information that complements gender identities and diversity, to ensure that information is written using gender-inclusive languages. Regarding products labeling, the guideline implements that packaging should not target a special group of consumers according to their gender, avoiding the use of colors or codes socially related to gender stereotypes. For example, it must be sexist. It would be sexist to show a big bike in a store next to a sign which says "just for girls." According to that, it recommended to use genderless colors, to avoid nouns related to gender stereotypes such as princess, champions, ladies, gentlemen, among others. The label must not include information related to biological characteristics or a specific gender. Other characteristics of the consumption relationship and consumer basic rights includes the guideline are those related to health and safety, advertising, fair treatment, and consumer services, language used for forms, contracts, and other documents. In regard to advertising, we believe that as part of the consumption relationship, suppliers have the duty to provide a fair and non-discriminatory treatment to consumers. In this order of ideas, the National Director monitors acts ex officio and has imposed fines for sexist and symbolic violence which enforce gender stereotypes. The guideline includes recommendations to avoid this kind of advertising, such as to show people in different roles and activities, no matter physical or biological characteristics, to show people with diverse gender identities performing tasks of care, parenting, cleaning, feeding, etc., to make visible those situations where women and LGBT+ participates in work, sports, or night spaces, to promote diversity in roles related to work both inside or outside home, to avoid advertising products which promote unhealthy and unrealistic body ideals, to represent all kinds of families, monoparental families with 2 women or 2 men, childless families, etc., to contribute in the eradication of stereotypes that show women as sexual objects, especially when that situation is not related to product. Those are some of the most representative examples of the recommendations. We highlight the importance of interinstitutional cooperation around those concepts to foster cooperation between all sectors involved. This best commercial practices guideline on gender and diversities represents an approach between all market parties to build consensus and inclusive language to generate healthier consumption habits and fair and non-discriminatory treatment. You can obtain more information about the National Director on Consumer Protection Policies on gender following the link argentina.gov.ar Defensa del Consumidor. Thanks for your time and kind attention.
Well, very well. The digital economy provides new consumption channels and new goods and services and new ways to access them. These entail challenges for businesses and for consumers. For example, from the business perspective, the challenges of presenting goods and services in a gender-neutral way, and from consumers' perspective, digital illiteracy, access to information, access to after-sales channels, dispute resolution, and redress. So I will now like to ask again 2 questions that are related to the challenges brought by the digital economy. What are the evolving needs of protecting consumers in the digital world? Is there a gender dimension? And can you give us some examples of where consumer protection made a difference for women in this context? And I would start with Helena. Please, you have the floor.
Sure, thank you. So it's great to hear from Argentina there. I just want to take the opportunity. So talking to our member, which has been present for 41 years in Argentina, and the leadership there, Claudia Collado, she was commenting, you know, the importance of this and how they have focused on gender identity and discrimination for a very long time. She added, and I would love to hear feedback from those who can participate and know different languages better than I do, but a thought about calling, rather than using one term, to say personas consumidoras as an approach which is perhaps less binary, and has been used by their organization Adelco for the past 2 years. So it'd be very interesting to hear that as an approach as well. Unfortunately, maybe we'll just sort of reach back to the former speaker just to find out his thoughts on that. So for the digital world, absolutely. So this is, you know, this one of the key areas I think here that I've been drawn into recently was looking at abuse of women and girls online. So in use of social, obviously there's a far broader span of topics we could cover here. And it includes, of course, you know, the way in which women and other groups are portrayed. But one thing that was particularly interesting and was an area where the Web Foundation did a campaign was that 38% of women and girls report that they are personally subject to online abuse on social platforms. This is much, much higher when you look at younger populations. So for a younger group, for the Gen Zs and millennials, that was a 45% reported people who reported abuse. And what I thought was interesting here is the part about partnership. You know, so really thinking about who can consumer advocates partner with in the digital rights arena, so that we can start to combine knowledge about consumer policy, about consumer rights, with that knowledge about what's possible, what are the harms that we're seeing in the digital space, and start to raise these things together. This was something I think is worth taking a look at. And I would go back then, rather than repeating some of the earlier points. I think there's a whole raft of different areas that are not just relevant for the traditional marketplace, but then, you know, from financial inclusion, the sort of discriminatory side of things, fair representation in advertising, and that whole piece about sustainable consumption apply just as much in an online environment.
Thank you very much, Helena. Well, very interesting remarks. I think in any case, this year we will have other occasions to discuss consumer protection, hopefully also in the digital context, in the UNCTAD e-commerce week 2022 that will take place at the end of April. But I would like also to hear from Arlin on this issue, because I'm sure that as part of eTrade for Women, she's very much familiar with the challenges and opportunities and constraints, I'm sure, also of the digital marketplace. Arlin, over to you.
Thank you, Teresa. Personally, I think there is one very big advantage of women in Indonesia is the access to the digital market as the commercial doer. So not just as a consumer, but as an entrepreneur. I find that women stands for almost 46% of all entrepreneurs in Indonesia, especially in the younger generation and e-commerce, because the access to online marketplaces is available for women. So that is one good thing. However, the logistics side of it, speaking from Indonesia, which is an archipelagic country, and the logistics problem, the distance, the technological advancement is not equal in every state or in every provinces. There can be a huge gap between women who live in big cities and metropolitan areas and women who live in more secluded areas or in villages. Even if they do have a digital mobile, even if they have access to online marketplaces, their understanding of the information presented might be different. And that's when they are most vulnerable to misinformation and to misrepresentation of products or information. So I think going back to my first statement about the honesty of producers and manufacturers and e-commerce owners in talking to their consumers is very important and crucial here. Unfortunately, it's very hard to screen women and underage children to not access the internet because of the availability of information. So it is up to us and up to the government to educate people to be more aware of what information they take in and what emotional reaction, because we are presented with something and then it depends on our own self, on our internal upbringing, on how we give our reaction to it. So I think it's best not to take what is good for us and filter out what's not good, and that ability is crucial to have and to disseminate to the women of any country.
Thank you very much. Very interesting remarks. I think, of course, we are focused today on consumer protection, but you are quite right. I think women face, as we have already heard, face challenges also as entrepreneurs, especially in the digital world, even though, well, thank God for Indonesia, you have access to digital marketplaces, but this is not really necessarily happening in the rest of the developing world. I would now hand over to Betilde to hear also our comments or replies to the questions raised. Betilde?
Excellent, excellent. Well, on the question of digital rights, of course, this is a field of great importance that has recently evolved very rapidly as a result of the pandemic. So with key challenges that we must address that have already been mentioned by my colleagues, such as the protection of personal information, identity theft, information sold on the dark web, disinformation. I mean, there's a plethora of challenges in this regard. And let's just say everyone is really exposed to these risks, but due to the gendered nature of the digital gap, the limited access that women have had to digital literacy, women may not be as tech savvy, or let's just say not tech savvy enough to take the appropriate measures to protect their rights and their information online. In terms of their buying consumer products online, especially on big online retailers, consumers can buy fake products. I mean, there's always the risk of buying fake products that can impact their safety and their health. You know, and there's many examples that we've seen in this regard. Another element of context, I mean, and this is also happening in the digital world. Another element of context that I wanted to mention, let's say, is that, you know, it's kind of interesting and maybe controversial, maybe a topic for discussion, but it's also the role or the growing dominance of influencers in social media platforms, where some of them can also reinforce stereotypes. Most of them, or a few of them, are paid to promote products that may be harmful to others. And you know, it takes us to the need to have people, and especially women, become ever more literate in the digital world to understand the importance of not believing, as it was just mentioned, everything they see on the internet, and do their research. The deputy SG also mentioned the dangers of algorithms, and how can, you know, all of us are exposed to these algorithms, and it's easy to fall in that how you call the rabbit's hole, as you know, is said. And in the literature and in the practice of consumer rights, there's a series of effects that these algorithms are having on people's and consumers' rights in general. They can learn, you know, these algorithms to exploit all kinds of consumer habits. There's the issue of availability cascades, you know, as when messages are repeated and repeated to convince consumers about this information on products. The bandwagon effects is another effect, as when messages, you know, convince consumers that they should do what everyone else is doing too, right? So, you know, the bandwagon effect, the confirmation biases, which also are part of our discussions in politics, but it also happens in consumer habits, you know, as when the offer is linked to what the consumer already likes or knows. The fear of missing out, that is also part of this realm. The herd behavior, as when people, you know, are offered rewards on the referral programs, and, you know, everyone is doing the same thing, and a couple of other effects that have been kind of mapped out in the literature. The issue of online threats have been mentioned, and they have a particular effect on women and girls. Of, you know, it may be especially felt in certain age ranges, but it's a problem that really affects women in general, because women, of course, as in everything else, experience the digital world in a differentiated manner. A point that I also wanted to mention is the issue of the gender digital divide. I mean, la brecha digital, we say in Spanish, and how we are seeing that this can also have an effect in people's and especially women's consumer habits, right? And there's a series of statistics that I'm not going to go into detail so that we can have more conversation towards the end. But the problem with the gender digital divide is also that as information about unsafe products is increasingly shared online, you know, women and other persons in situations of vulnerability may not have access to that information and be therefore exposed at the risk of these products, you know, unsafe products. At the OAS, just also wanted to mention, we worry about inequalities amongst countries, and really as stated in the SDGs, and it's something that we aspire to work on, but we also worry about inequalities within countries, especially taking a look at the reality of women and groups in situation of vulnerability. And perhaps here the call or the invitation is to look at these issues, not just as we've been mentioning in binary terms, but in terms of the intersections that could exist in the realities of women who may also be Afro-descendants, or women who may also live in a rural area and be indigenous and also are part of the, or let's just say we have a mandate to protect the rights of their rights too. And three very concrete points in closing that I wanted to, that kind of were provoked by the comments by the colleagues that went ahead of me. On the point of leadership mentioned by Helena, I mean, I really like this issue of women in positions of leadership, in positions of power. I just wanted to share an interesting point of information on the role of women in making decisions about unsafe products. You know, we reviewed a product that indicated that in life-threatening situations when, for instance, defective medical products may kill a consumer, companies with female directors issue recalls much more quickly than those that do not have this representation. And for less severe instances in which there is greater discretion in the recall decision, recalls occur more frequently for companies to have women on their boards. So a point there on the changing nature of decision-making in terms of protecting consumer rights when women are sitting next to men on equal terms. And two final points. One, I mean, you asked about examples. I think we can discuss those later, but I guess there's many examples out there in terms of what not to do, and then and good examples too in terms of what should be done. But I guess the point here is to try to avoid perpetuating the roles that women and men have, because this also affects men, have been sort of put in history, throughout history. So not to go into specific examples, but I guess we know where the north and where the aspiration is. And finally, just commend the Argentinian government on producing this guide to consumer rights with a gender perspective. Recognize Sebastián's leadership in getting this out there, because I believe it's a very important contribution to understanding the protection of consumer rights, not just in Latin America, but throughout the world.
Thank you very much, Betilde. Well, we have obviously agreed, especially on what you just mentioned, the pioneer and the innovation behind this guide. That's why we thought this was so interesting to share, since in any case, advertising still plays a major role in, well, in informing, between brackets, consumers, and sometimes perpetuating those stereotypes that we have been discussing. I would now like to open the floor to questions or comments, even though I don't see any. So maybe if we don't have, as we don't have much more time, I would ask the DSG if she would like to comment on what she heard and also make her final remarks, because so much was shared and discussed. Over to you, DSG.
Thank you, Teresa. Yes, true. When you touch consumer protection, and especially through the gender lens, you touch all the problem of gender inequality, all. Education, stereotypes, perpetuation, production. So we touch all the things. So I think that it's really an issue which is not a small silo, a small piece in the big issue. It's the issue as such. And I just want to highlight or to highlights different features that you shows. 89% of the women are doing the daily shopping. So it means that, of course, for the producers and for the commercial approach, it's a big market. And it's, of course, one of the reasons that they are so focused through the advertisement and all the ways to influence the way that they organize their purchases. So that means that, of course, education is important, but also what I think that it's Arlin speaking about, the emotional intelligence, and not only education. Education is something which is, okay, you receive information or guide, and I think that we have to work probably more deeply on this, the effect of this new guidelines in Argentina, to look how it was implemented, which are how they monitor that on a daily basis in order to assess the effect of these guidelines. But it's true that emotional intelligence is probably more important than just only education. So in addition to that, I think that what was said about influencer is also something that we have to take into consideration, because algorithms, we know, algorithms in the digital world are guiding us where we put our footprint in the system. Okay, you buy a receipt for, I don't know, cooking, I don't know what, and then you will receive receipt on all those issues all the time. But more than that, the influencers are, for me, an important issue, because they are paid by companies, and they appear as a citizens like you, as a peer, just a woman, a friend, explaining his or her experience, I don't know in which domain, but it's not the case. They are paid by companies to show, and to its new form of advertising, which is more regarding emotional intelligence. It's not just advertisement on television or even on the social media. It's something which is really appearing as neutral, a friend. It's absolutely not neutral, and that's also something that we have to look at on a way, and maybe to organize also a kind of opposite influencing. I think that's it's a way to show how it could be dangerous. So just the last issue, it's true that the female leadership helps in the past, helps in a lot of situations. It's not a miraculous, because women cannot change the world alone, and they will not. But I think that we have really to look, and that's also something for Teresa, how we could in the next months and years work more closely on some specific aspect where the female leadership or the female way to work change habits, change the way to not only to provide the guidelines, and I'm very happy that Mr. Barocelli is a man, it's nice, but it's also how it changed the way to disseminate the information, and trying to change the habits through a female leadership is also very, very important to, as you said, to go quickly, more efficiently, and right to the goal, or to the goal that you have in this regard. Finally, I think that it's also important that what Helena said, what is the norm for the future? And that's really what we have to work on, because we are, as UNCTAD, an organization providing recommendation. We are not an executive body. We are there to try to influence. And I think that what was said also by Arlin, it's not a question of developing countries. All countries are really confronted or facing this issue. Even in of course, a little bit differently in Indonesia, because it's a Muslim country, or yeah, of course, they have different culture. Nevertheless, all countries are facing the same problem. And I agree that intersectionality is something which could help, the addition of the accumulation of discrimination. It's something which is the case everywhere in the world. And I would like that we could really go back to what is the human right. I mean, it's not only a woman right, it's a human right. As human being, you deserve to be respected, to be protected, and to be considered as a person able to have your own point of view, or your own capacity to drive your life, and also your consumptions. So I think that we have to build step by step which are the norm for the future, and maybe the guide of Argentina, and especially how it will be implemented in the future, and which are the result of this experience, could help us to look what has to be done in order to determine or to help to really contribute to the norm of the future, which has to be equal regarding gender, and not only women and men, but all the question of LGBTs and all not binary gender issue, but also all the other discrimination, because it's true that when you are people from another culture, another language, another experience, you are also discriminated as not exactly in the mainstream category of citizens. And I think that that's an issue that sometimes we are forgetting because we are focused on the rules, but we have also to look how we can change the rules through the behavior, because I think that we will never ban. Yes, of course, we have to ban products which are dangerous. Of course, there are rules. Nevertheless, more than that, it's also how it can be, the people can be educated. So that's something that I would like that we could work more and more in the future.
Well, thank you very much, DSG. We are getting very close to the end. I don't know if one of our speakers has any pressing final remarks so that we can close. But in any case, what I wanted to just underline, of course, you are all aware of this, is that UNCTAD is the guardian of the United Nations guidelines for consumer protection, and has several of you mentioned, and just recently the DSG, there is the recognition of the protection of vulnerable and disadvantaged consumers that somehow encompass, of course, children, the elderly, immigrants, persons with disabilities, persons or families with low income, persons living in rural environments or remote environments. And it is a world of possibilities of actually addressing not only in developing countries, but let's say not only between countries, but within countries, as rightly mentioned by Betilde, the number of discriminations that needs to be overcome or at least reduced. I think that through our work, meaning the work of UNCTAD, both in trade and gender, and with initiatives such as eTrade for women, and of course in the broader field of consumer protection, we are really for once addressing individuals, which is not typical, I would say, for UNCTAD, because of course dealing with trade and development, you are talking more about markets and tend to focus more on the production side. But of course the consumption side is extremely important, namely nowadays to face the challenge brought by climate change and the environmental degradation. So we will continue working after these very inspiring, very strong, very motivating remarks. And I think on this note, I would like to close this event. We will have other editions of Les 8 du Mois until we're there to discuss this and other issues. Let me just mention that on the 15th of March, where we celebrate the World Consumer Rights Day this year, we will be talking about sustainable consumption and how we can empower consumers to play an active role. Thank you very much to Madame Durant, to our friends Betilde, Helena, Arlin, now a new friend, and thank you also to the UNCTAD team that allowed us to be here together today. Have a good day. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thanks so much. Good day, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye, Arlene.